A Navy SEAL returned to his snow-covered home after a full year away, carrying one heavy backpack, and questions he was afraid to ask. At the doorway, his loyal German shepherd stood beside an elderly neighbor who had cared for her through every lonely season. But there was someone else waiting on the steps. A tiny German shepherd puppy the soldier had never seen suddenly rose onto two legs and reached both paws toward him. Why did the puppy react before the mother dog moved? Could a puppy recognize a man it had never met? And what had happened inside that quiet house while the soldier was gone? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late winter rested quietly over Bozeman, Montana, softening roofs, fences, and bare cottonwoods beneath new snow. The Bridger Mountains stood pale beyond the neighborhood while evening gathered around the small blue-gray house at the end of Hawthorne Lane. Inside, Ruth Caldwell watched the clock above the kitchen doorway approach 5:47. Ruth was 76, a slender widow with weathered skin, silver hair twisted into a loose bun, and clear gray eyes that had once persuaded generations of third-graders to tell the truth. Age had rounded her shoulders, but not her opinions. One hand rested on the counter whenever she turned too quickly. The bruise along her left forearm had yellowed at the edges, hidden beneath a moss-green cardigan for 11 days. At 5:46, Maggie rose from the braided rug beside the stove. The 5-year-old German shepherd was large and deep-chested, with a black saddle across rich tan fur, amber-brown eyes, and the first silver hairs beneath her muzzle. Maggie was disciplined without being cold, and loyal with the seriousness of an old promise. During the first month after Daniel Brooks left for an overseas assignment, Maggie searched the house each evening. She checked the basement, pushed open the mudroom door, circled the shed, sniffed beside Daniel's faded blue truck, and once stood behind the bedroom curtains as if he might be hiding there. After 32 days, Maggie stopped searching. Ruth thought the dog was accepting the truth. She was wrong. Maggie had simply chosen one place to keep her hope. The clock clicked to 5:47. Maggie lifted a worn navy blue training glove from the basket and carried it to the front door. The glove belonged to Daniel, a 41-year-old Navy SEAL with a tall, athletic frame, short, dark brown hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and a strong face sharpened by discipline. Daniel was patient with animals, respectful toward older neighbors, and guarded with nearly everyone else. His father's death when Daniel was 19 had taught him to leave before grief could ask him to stay. Before the deployment, Daniel returned from training at almost the same minute each afternoon. He would open the door and say, "Easy, Maggie, I'm home." Maggie placed the glove between her paws. 8 weeks earlier, she had begun bringing company. Scout waddled after his mother with the confidence of a puppy who believed every floor had been designed for him. The tiny German shepherd was black and tan, with soft fur, one ear beginning to stand while the other folded sideways, and a white mark beneath his chin. Scout was the only puppy to survive a difficult birth. He had never seen Daniel's face, smelled his hands, or heard his boots cross the porch. Yet each evening he followed Maggie to the door, pressed his side against her foreleg, and stared wherever she stared. Scout did not understand absence. He understood only that his mother became still at 5:47, and therefore stillness must matter. Ruth lowered herself into the armchair behind them. Her right hip protested after the second fall of the winter. The first had happened beside the mailbox. The second had happened in the bathroom, where Ruth sat on the cold tile for 20 minutes before pulling herself up by the towel rail. She had not called Laura. Laura Caldwell, Ruth's 51-year-old daughter, was a tall hospital nurse in Billings, with auburn hair cut at her jaw, pale freckled skin, and direct blue eyes that could turn concern into an order before breakfast. Laura loved fiercely and worried efficiently. Since her father's death 6 years earlier, every loose rug, icy step, and unanswered phone call had become an enemy. That morning, a thick envelope from Laura had arrived. Inside were photographs of a senior living community. Bright dining rooms, smiling strangers holding watercolor brushes, and shining handrails. Laura had underlined one sentence: "Independent living with support when needed." Ruth read it twice, then hid the packet beneath her knitting basket. Her late husband, Henry, had built the house with broad hands and stubborn patience. He had been a quiet carpenter who trusted measurements more than promises and hummed old hymns whenever he worked. Henry had shaped the porch rails, cabinets, and narrow window seat as though love might remain longer when fastened properly. Leaving felt less like moving than admitting the walls no longer knew Ruth. Outside, tires hissed over snow. Maggie's ears lifted. Scout copied her a moment later, one ear upright and the other collapsing in confusion. A car door slammed farther down the street. Maggie's body tightened, but the footsteps passed, her ears lowered by a fraction. Ruth had watched that small disappointment hundreds of times. Hope, she had learned, was not always bright. Sometimes it was a dog sitting before a door with an old glove, refusing to be embarrassed. Ruth sometimes wondered what Maggie believed was happening beyond that door. People had calendars, maps, explanations, and the cruel comfort of knowing how far away someone had gone. A dog possessed none of those things. Maggie knew only that Daniel had left carrying a bag and wearing the expression he used whenever he wanted others to believe he was not afraid. Ruth remembered standing beside him on the porch that morning. Daniel had crouched, pressed his forehead against Maggie's, and promised he would return. Then he had risen too quickly, as if remaining on one knee might make leaving impossible. At 6:20, Maggie finally carried the glove back to the basket. Scout followed, tripped over the rug, then attacked the offending edge with great seriousness. Ruth smiled despite herself. Scout had inherited Maggie's attentive eyes, but none of her dignity. He frequently ran into furniture, growled at his reflection in the oven door, and once spent several determined minutes trying to intimidate a baked potato. His foolish courage brought laughter into rooms that had grown too accustomed to silence. Ruth fed both dogs and settled beside the lamp. The hidden brochure pressed beneath the knitting basket like a second heartbeat. Laura believed the senior community would provide safety, companionship, and someone nearby if Ruth fell again. Ruth understood the logic. She simply resented the way sensible decisions could feel so much like surrender. She tried not to think about the bruise or Daniel's message from earlier that day. "Flight lands tomorrow. Don't tell Maggie. I need to know if she remembers." The request had irritated Ruth. Daniel had survived dangerous assignments, freezing nights, and decisions most people would never be asked to make. Yet he was frightened of being forgotten by a dog who had rebuilt her entire day around his return. Ruth had typed 3 different replies before sending only, "Understood." She reached for her phone to silence a reminder and touched the wrong notification. An old voice message opened. Static filled the room, followed by Daniel's low, tired voice. "Easy, Maggie. I'm coming home." Maggie's head rose at once. Ruth expected that. What she did not expect was Scout. The puppy woke from a dead sleep, scrambled across the rug, and ran to the phone. Scout pressed his small black nose against the speaker, breathing quickly, then sat beneath Ruth's hand as the message played again. His uneven ears leaned forward, his tail became still. He had never seen Daniel, but the voice had reached him before memory had a shape. Ruth looked from the puppy to the dark front door and felt something inside her loosen. Scout did not know the man, but he knew the sound of home. 8 weeks earlier, winter had not yet tightened its full grip around Bozeman, but the first hard snow already lay in the shadows beneath the cottonwoods. The sky hung low and gray over Hawthorne Lane, and the wind carried the clean metallic scent that warned of colder nights ahead. Ruth Caldwell first knew something was wrong when Maggie stopped meeting her at the back door. The 5-year-old German Shepherd had always greeted Ruth with quiet dignity, never jumping, never barking without reason, merely touching her nose to the widow's hand before stepping aside. That morning, however, Maggie remained upstairs. Ruth found the dog inside Daniel's bedroom closet, pulling an old wool blanket into a rough circle beneath his hanging shirts. Maggie's amber-brown eyes followed every movement Ruth made. When Ruth reached toward the blanket, the dog gave a low warning sound. It was not aggressive, but it was unmistakable. Maggie was frightened, and frightened mothers often built walls before anyone else understood what they were protecting. Over the next 2 days, Maggie ate little, slept heavily, and carried towels into the closet. Ruth contacted Bridger Creek Veterinary Clinic, where Dr. Hannah Pierce had treated Maggie since puppyhood. Hannah was a 48-year-old veterinarian with a sturdy build, warm brown skin, short black curls threaded with silver, and patient dark eyes that seemed to notice what people tried not to say. Years earlier, Hannah had lost an elderly Labrador during an emergency surgery and had responded by becoming even more careful rather than more distant. She spoke gently, but she never softened facts merely to make them easier to hear. The examination confirmed that Maggie was pregnant. Ruth stared at the ultrasound screen and felt surprise give way to confusion. Daniel had discussed breeding Maggie through a responsible working dog program before leaving, but no natural mating had taken place. Hannah explained that Daniel had signed authorization for a veterinary insemination using preserved genetic material from a retired search and rescue German Shepherd. The procedure had been postponed when the first attempt at timing failed, then completed 10 weeks earlier under the care plan Daniel had approved. The male dog had been 7 years old, broad-chested and sable-coated, with strong hips, a steady temperament, and a record of locating 3 missing hikers during Montana winters. Daniel had wanted Maggie's intelligence and calm nature preserved, but he had departed before knowing whether the procedure had succeeded. Ruth had received a clinic notice about the final appointment, but assumed Daniel had already been informed. Communication overseas had been unreliable, and every message about the pregnancy returned undelivered. "He is going to come home and find a nursery," Ruth said. Hannah gave the ultrasound screen a small smile. "Judging by Maggie's expression, he may also find that his closet has been permanently reassigned." The pregnancy changed Maggie in ways Ruth had not expected. The disciplined dog became restless after sunset, pacing from Daniel's bedroom to the front door and back again. She still kept the appointment at 5:47, but now she carried the worn navy training glove upstairs afterward and placed it beside the nest. Ruth began sleeping in Daniel's guest room because she feared Maggie might need help during the night. She also began hiding her own weakness more carefully. Her right hip had grown painful, and climbing the stairs required one hand on the rail and another against the wall. She did not tell Laura. She told herself that there was no reason to worry her daughter before the puppies arrived, though the truth was less noble. Ruth could tolerate pain more easily than pity. Then the storm came. Snow began before dusk and thickened until the road vanished beneath white sheets. Wind struck the house hard enough to rattle the kitchen windows. Maggie went into labor shortly after midnight. Ruth called Hannah, but a fallen power line and 2 blocked roads prevented the veterinarian from reaching Hawthorne Lane. Hannah stayed on the phone, guiding Ruth through each stage while emergency crews worked to clear a path. 3 puppies were born before dawn. The first was still. The second lived only a few minutes despite Ruth's efforts. The third arrived small, weak, and silent. Ruth rubbed the tiny black and tan body inside a warm towel while Maggie watched with exhausted terror. At last the puppy coughed, drew a thin breath, and released a faint cry. Ruth named him Scout only in her thoughts, because it seemed wrong to give a name before Daniel had seen him. Maggie was bleeding more than Hannah liked, and the dog's muscles trembled from exhaustion. He would not settle beside the surviving puppy. Each time Scout tried to crawl toward her, Maggie stood again, turning frantic circles around the nest as though searching for the 2 lives that had already gone quiet. Ruth felt helpless in the way humans often did when love demanded a skill they did not possess. She had raised a daughter, taught hundreds of children, and sat beside her husband through his final illness. Yet none of that told her how to explain loss to an animal who could smell that something was missing. Ruth searched her phone for anything familiar. She found an old voice message Daniel had sent months earlier after Maggie refused food during a thunderstorm. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by Daniel's low voice. "Easy, Maggie. Lie down. You're safe." Maggie froze. Her ears lifted. Ruth played the message again and placed the phone beside the nest. The dog's breathing slowed. On the third repetition, Maggie lowered herself carefully onto the blankets. Scout crawled toward the warmth of her belly and began to nurse. Ruth sat on the closet floor, one hand pressed over her mouth, while the storm battered the house like an impatient visitor. Daniel's voice continued from the phone, detached from face and body, yet strong enough to make the frightened room feel less abandoned. By morning, Hannah arrived in a four-wheel drive vehicle with a county snowplow behind her. Maggie required medication and fluids but survived. Scout remained fragile for several days. Ruth opened Daniel's messages during every feeding. Soon the puppy reacted before Maggie did. At the first sound of Daniel's voice, Scout's head lifted. His paws began kneading the blanket, and his small body turned toward the speaker. To Scout, the unseen man became part of the pattern of survival. The voice came, Maggie relaxed, milk followed, and the world became safe again. Thousands of miles away, Daniel Brooks prepared to leave his overseas post without feeling that he was going home. Ethan Cole, the teammate injured during their final operation, remained in a military rehabilitation hospital. Ethan was 32, lean and long-limbed, with sandy hair, a narrow, freckled face, and an easy humor that had once made even difficult men trust him. A damaged left leg had changed the way Ethan walked, but not the habit of making jokes when everyone else grew too serious. Daniel believed the injury was the result of an order he had given under pressure. Ethan insisted Daniel's decision had prevented greater loss, but guilt rarely accepted testimony that contradicted its sentence. Rather than remain in Bozeman after returning, Daniel accepted a private security position abroad. 4 days at home, he told himself, would be enough to inspect the house, see Maggie, repair whatever needed attention, and leave before memory began asking questions. He knew nothing about Scout. On the night before Daniel's arrival, 8 weeks after the storm, Ruth sat beside Maggie's bed while Scout slept curled inside the protective curve of his mother's body. Her phone vibrated with a short message. "Flight landed. Don't tell Maggie. I need to know if she still remembers." Ruth looked at the German shepherd who had carried Daniel's glove between rooms for almost a year, then at the puppy raised beside a voice without a face. "He is worried the dog forgot him," Ruth murmured. "A man can survive war and still misunderstand the simplest thing." Beyond the window, headlights moved slowly across the snow. The headlights that crossed the snow the previous night belonged to a county plow. And by the following afternoon, Bozeman had settled beneath a pale winter sky that made every rooftop look newly washed. The storm clouds had moved east, leaving the streets narrow between walls of shoveled snow, and the Bridger Mountains sharp against the distance. Inside Daniel Brooks's house, Ruth Caldwell folded a small blanket beside the stove, while Maggie slept with one ear raised. Scout was awake, as puppies often were when the rest of the world had finally earned a little peace. The 8-week-old German shepherd was lying on his back beneath the kitchen table, chewing one corner of a dish towel with solemn concentration. One ear stood upright, while the other folded toward his cheek, giving him the appearance of receiving important information from only one side of the universe. Ruth had just rescued the towel when tires crunched to a stop beside the curb. Maggie rose before the engine went silent. There was none of the ordinary stretching or cautious sniffing that preceded a trip outside. The German shepherd stood in a single, smooth motion, her deep chest lifted and her amber eyes fixed on the hallway. Scout rolled onto his stomach, watched his mother, then scrambled after her. His paws lost their grip on the polished floor, sending him sliding sideways into the wall. He recovered without embarrassment and hurried to the front door as though the collision had been part of a complicated tactical maneuver. Maggie stopped directly before the threshold. Every muscle along her back tightened beneath the black saddle of her coat. Outside, a vehicle door closed. Boots crossed the shoveled path, climbed the porch steps, and paused beneath the awning. Maggie's ears pointed forward so sharply that Ruth felt her own heartbeat answer them. For nearly a year, the dog had listened to hundreds of footsteps. Neighbors carrying groceries, children selling school calendars, repairmen, delivery drivers, and strangers who had simply chosen the wrong driveway. Each set had disappointed her. Yet hope had not made Maggie less attentive. It had made her precise. A shadow appeared through the frosted glass. Ruth's hand went to the deadbolt before common sense could catch up. She had received Daniel's message. She knew he had landed. The knowledge moved through her faster than caution. As Ruth turned the lock from inside, the metal clicked loudly in the quiet hallway. Maggie produced a low, uneven sound, something caught between a trill and a whimper. Scout looked up at his mother and attempted to imitate her. What emerged from his small chest sounded like a hiccup arguing with a squeak. Under different circumstances, Ruth might have laughed. Instead, she opened the door. The man on the porch was not Daniel. He was Walter Briggs, a 68-year-old postal carrier with a heavy gray mustache, a broad red face shaped by decades of Montana wind, and a slight bend in his left knee from an old motorcycle accident. Walter was patient with dogs, suspicious of electronic tracking systems, and famous along Hawthorne Lane for remembering every resident's birthday while forgetting where he had placed his reading glasses. He held a rectangular parcel against his brown winter coat and looked from Ruth to Maggie with immediate regret. "This was meant for number 14, he said. "I saw the name Brooks and apparently decided numbers had become optional." Maggie did not bark. That was worse. She stepped backward once, and Ruth watched the certainty leave her body in small degrees. Her ears lowered, not flattened in fear, only turned slightly away from the man who was not the one she wanted. The sound in her throat stopped. Maggie looked toward the open doorway, taking in Walter's wool coat, his snow-covered boots, and the absence behind him. Then she turned away. Walter removed his cap. "I'm sorry, girl," he said, though no one had explained anything to him. Perhaps he did not need an explanation. Older people and loyal animals often recognized disappointment without being introduced to it. Ruth took the parcel and murmured that no harm had been done, but the sentence felt dishonest. Maggie walked 3 steps into the living room and sat facing the wall beside the cold fireplace. For the first time in nearly a year, she did not return to the door after the wrong footsteps faded. Walter watched her for a moment, his weathered face softening, then backed down the steps as quietly as a large man could. Scout remained near the threshold, puzzled by the sudden collapse of the ritual. He sniffed the place where Walter had stood, sneezed, and turned toward his mother. The puppy hurried to the basket beside the stairs, gripped Daniel's worn Navy training glove between his teeth, and dragged it across the floor. The glove was almost as long as Scout's body. He tripped over one finger, growled at it, and continued. When he reached Maggie, Scout placed the glove beside her front paws. Maggie did not look down. Scout pushed it closer with his nose, then pressed his small shoulder against her leg. The gesture was clumsy, but Ruth understood it. Scout had no memory of Daniel, no concept of deployment, and no fear of a promise being broken. He only knew his mother had become still in the wrong way, and he had brought the object that usually made stillness bearable. The front door opened again before Ruth could sit down. Laura Caldwell entered without knocking, carrying a canvas overnight bag and enough cold air to move the curtains. At 51, Laura was tall and straight-backed, with auburn hair cut neatly along her jaw, pale, freckled skin, and blue eyes made sharper by years of watching hospital monitors change without warning. She wore navy scrubs beneath a long, black coat, evidence that she had driven directly from Billings after finishing a night shift. Laura had inherited Henry Caldwell's practical hands, and Ruth's inability to surrender an argument once it had learned to walk. "You didn't answer 3 calls," she said. "I was opening the door." That takes 7 minutes now? It does when the mailman brings emotional devastation with a package. Laura looked toward Maggie, then at Scout leaning against her. Concern crossed her face, but it was displaced when Ruth reached for the parcel and her cardigan sleeve pulled back. The bruise along Ruth's left forearm was no longer purple, but it remained large enough to silence the room. Laura set down her bag. What happened? Ruth covered the bruise. I bumped the bathroom counter. You told me last week you bruised it carrying firewood. It was a very complicated morning. Laura crossed the room and gently took her mother's wrist. Her fingers were warm and careful, the hands of a nurse rather than an angry daughter. You fell again. The word again changed everything. Ruth pulled her arm away. I am standing in front of you. That does not mean you were standing the entire time. I did not break anything. You sat on the floor alone and decided that counted as success. Ruth felt shame rise before anger, and because shame was harder to admit, she chose anger. You have already mailed me a brochure, Laura. Perhaps next time send a moving truck with it. Laura's face tightened. I sent information, not a prison sentence. You circled the rooms you liked. I circled the rooms without stairs. You turn love into a list of things I'm no longer allowed to do. And you turn pride into an excuse to make sure no one gets close enough to help. The words landed hard. Between them, Maggie remained facing the wall, her body curved protectively around the small puppy now seated beside her. Ruth looked at the dog and understood with painful clarity that more than one creature in the room had confused endurance with safety. Maggie had waited alone because she had no choice. Ruth had been doing the same while insisting it was independence. Laura's anger faded first. It usually did. Beneath the efficiency and the instructions was a woman who had already lost one parent and lived in quiet fear of losing the other between two unanswered calls. I don't want to take your house, Laura said. I want you alive inside it. Ruth looked toward the window. Your father built that porch. I know. He measured every board twice. He still cut the third railing too short. Despite herself, Ruth almost smiled. Henry had blamed the lumber, the tape measure, and possibly the government before admitting the mistake. The memory softened nothing enough to solve the argument, but it gave both women somewhere to stand. Laura picked up her bag. I should go before the road freezes. Ruth did not ask her to stay. Laura did not mention the brochure again. At the doorway, however, a heavy engine sounded beyond the cottonwoods, low, uneven, and familiar in a way Ruth felt before she understood it. Scout's head snapped up. The puppy had never seen Daniel's faded blue truck. He had never heard its aging engine or the loose exhaust that rattled when it idled. Yet, Scout ran toward the door, making short, urgent chirps. Maggie turned away from the wall. Through the front window, beneath the bare cottonwood, a faded blue truck with a dented rear bumper came slowly to a stop. The late afternoon sky over Bozeman had turned the color of old silver, and fine snow drifted between the bare cottonwoods without enough wind to hurry it anywhere. The faded blue truck idled beneath the tree in front of Daniel Brooks's house, its dented rear bumper trembling with the uneven rhythm of an engine that had outlived several sensible opportunities for retirement. For a few seconds, no one moved. Ruth stood inside Daniel's living room with one hand resting against the window frame. Laura remained beside the front door, her overnight bag still hanging from one shoulder. Maggie had risen from the corner where disappointment had left her facing the wall. Scout stood beneath her chest, making short, urgent chirps at the glass. Then the driver's door opened. Daniel steps down into the snow wearing a Navy working uniform Type 3 beneath a dark winter jacket, the green-gray-brown camouflage softened by travel and creased at the elbows. A large olive backpack rested across his broad shoulders. Snow gathered around his worn boots as he closed the truck door and looked toward the house he had not seen for nearly a year. Daniel was 41, tall and athletic, though the man returning to Hawthorne Lane was leaner than the one Ruth remembered. His short, dark brown hair had been freshly cut, and his neatly trimmed beard sharpened a face already made angular by exhaustion. A pale scar ran beneath his chin, nearly hidden in the beard. His eyes were gray-blue and habitually alert, moving first to the upstairs windows, then the roofline, the side gate, Laura's parked car, and finally the figures behind the storm door. Ruth noticed that Daniel's right hand briefly touched the strap crossing his chest, checking its position without conscious thought. Even at home, he seemed to be counting doors, distances, and possible exits. Laura saw it too. She had known soldiers through the hospital, men and women who entered ordinary rooms as though danger might be waiting behind the coat rack. Daniel did not resemble the smiling man in Ruth's framed photographs. That Daniel had been solid, sun-browned, and faintly amused by the world. This Daniel looked as though sleep had become a place he no longer trusted. Daniel climbed the porch steps and stopped when Maggie came fully into view behind the screen. For one fragile instant, his entire expression opened. Then he saw Scout. The puppy stood between Maggie's front legs, one ear upright, the other folded sideways, his small black and tan body vibrating with curiosity. Daniel's gaze moved from the puppy to Maggie's belly, then back again. Confusion crossed his face before understanding found it. He lowered the backpack from his shoulder with unusual care and set it in the snow. Maggie pushed through the door when Ruth opened it, but the German Shepherd did not run. She descended one step and froze. Daniel knew the hesitation immediately. Maggie recognized the shape of him, the broad shoulders, the slight outward turn of his left foot, the way he leaned forward when approaching her. She knew the scuffed boots and the cadence of his breathing. Yet scent carried a different story. Daniel smelled of airports, recycled cabin air, dry sand, antiseptic soap, jet fuel, unfamiliar buildings, and hundreds of strangers. Beneath those layers remains the man Maggie had waited for, but nearly a year had buried him deeply. Maggie lifted her nose and drew in one long breath. Her ears moved forward, then sideways. Daniel felt something inside his chest tighten. He had imagined this moment through nights when he could not sleep, but in every version Maggie had recognized him without doubt. The possibility that she might not had seemed foolish from thousands of miles away. Standing before her now, it felt like judgment. Perhaps the house had learned to function without him. Perhaps loyalty, like every other living thing, had limits. Ruth watched the thought pass across his face and understood why he had asked whether Maggie remembered. Daniel was not testing the dog. He was asking whether there was still a place in the world where his absence had not become easier than his return. Daniel removed his gloves and tucked them into his jacket pocket. Then he lowered himself slowly onto one knee in the snow. He did not reach for Maggie. He knew better than to demand trust from an animal already offering courage simply by remaining. His hands rested open on his thighs. For several seconds, the only sounds were the truck's engine, Scout's quick breathing, and snow whispering against the porch rails. Daniel's voice came out lower and rougher than Ruth remembered. "Easy, Maggie. I'm home." The words moved through Maggie like a current. Her ears lifted completely. The uncertainty vanished from her posture so suddenly that Ruth almost heard it break. Maggie crossed the remaining distance in 3 strides and pressed her forehead against Daniel's chest. She did not jump or bark. She simply leaned into him with the full weight of a year. Daniel folded both arms around the German Shepherd. One bare hand spread across the black fur between her shoulders, while the other settled behind her ears. His fingers trembled. Maggie held her head against him as though she were listening for proof beneath fabric and bone. Daniel bent over her, closing his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I know, girl." It was unclear whether he was apologizing for leaving, thanking her for waiting, or admitting that he had needed this more than he had allowed himself to understand. Perhaps the truest words carried several meanings at once. Scout remained on the porch. The puppy had no memory to recover. Daniel's face meant nothing to him. The uniform, backpack, boots, and foreign scents belonged to a stranger who had suddenly taken possession of his mother. Scout watched Maggie press close to Daniel, his small brow wrinkling. Then Daniel spoke again. "You're all right. I'm here." Scout became perfectly still. The voice was the one that had filled the closet during the storm. It was the sound that arrived before milk, before warmth, before Maggie's trembling stopped. Yet the sound no longer came from Ruth's phone. It came from the kneeling man in the snow. Scout looked toward the living room, turned abruptly, and ran inside. His paws slipped on the wooden floor, but this time he did not pause to argue with gravity. He hurried to the basket, seized Daniel's worn navy training glove, and dragged it back toward the porch. Laura covered her mouth with one hand. Ruth felt tears rise, but refused to blink, unwilling to miss even a second. Scout wrestled the glove across the threshold, nearly tumbled down the first step, then carried it to Daniel and dropped it on top of his snow-covered boots. Daniel stared at the glove. He recognized the split seam along the thumb and the small tooth marks Maggie had made years earlier. Before he could speak, Scout rose onto his hind legs and lifted both front paws toward him. The gesture was unsteady, hopeful, and completely impractical. Scout began to fall backward. Daniel caught the puppy against his chest. For an instant, Scout stiffened. His nose worked rapidly across Daniel's jacket, sorting unfamiliar odors. Then Daniel murmured, "Easy, little man." Scout's upright ear twitched. The puppy pressed the side of his head against Daniel's chest, listening to the heartbeat beneath the voice he had known since birth. His small body relaxed one muscle at a time. Daniel held him with the careful wonder of a man receiving something he had no idea he had lost. Maggie stood close enough that her shoulder touched Daniel's arm, watching Scout settle into the place she had guarded for him. Ruth and Laura had moved onto the neighboring porch without realizing it, giving the reunion the privacy of distance while remaining near enough to witness it. Laura studied Daniel's bowed head and understood that some people returned home carrying no visible wound, yet still moved as though a piece of themselves might break loose if they stopped being careful. Ruth saw something else. Daniel had feared Maggie might no longer need him, but Maggie had not spent the year preserving emptiness. She had raised a living bridge across it. Daniel finally looked toward Ruth. His eyes had reddened, and his voice was barely steady. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Ruth descended one step from the neighboring porch, keeping one hand on the rail. "Scout never saw you," she said. "But that puppy heard you every day." Daniel looked down. Scout raised one small paw and placed it against his chin. The touch undid what discipline had been holding together. A tear slipped into Daniel's beard. Scout leaned forward, licked it once, and immediately sneezed into Daniel's face, as though sorrow was acceptable but should never become self-important. Daniel laughed through the tears, a broken sound at first, then a real one. Maggie pressed closer. Scout remained in his arms, and for the first time since the truck stopped beneath the cottonwood, Daniel no longer looked for an exit. Night settled over Bozeman beneath a sky emptied of stars, and the snow along Hawthorne Lane reflected the porch lights with a pale blue glow. Daniel Brooks stood inside his own bedroom and looked at the familiar room as though it belonged to someone he had once known well. The walnut dresser remained beneath the window. His father's old brass compass still rested beside the lamp. Ruth had washed the sheets, dusted the shelves, and left everything in its place. But preservation could make a room feel stranger than neglect. Nothing had changed, which only showed Daniel how much he had. Maggie followed him upstairs and inspected every corner he entered. The 5-year-old German shepherd moved with quiet purpose, her amber eyes shifting repeatedly from Daniel to the hallway. When he closed the bedroom door halfway, Maggie pushed it open with her nose and lay across the threshold, her large black and tan body forming a patient barricade. She did not appear anxious. She simply seemed unwilling to trust doors with him yet. Scout showed less dignity. The 8-week-old German Shepherd puppy climbed onto the bed after 3 unsuccessful attempts, each ending with his back paws scrambling against the frame. Once successful, Scout marched directly across Daniel's chest, circled the pillow twice, and collapsed in the center of it. One ear stood almost upright, while the other folded against the blanket. Daniel tried moving him to the foot of the bed. Scout woke, crawled back, and planted both front paws beneath Daniel's chin. "I outrank you," Daniel murmured. Scout yawned into his beard. Rank, apparently, was a human superstition. For a while, Daniel lay awake, listening to Maggie breathe in the doorway and Scout snore with the astonishing confidence of a creature weighing less than one of his boots. He had slept in aircraft, tents, concrete rooms, armored vehicles, and places where the floor trembled through the night. Yet the quiet of his own house made him uneasy. Silence overseas had often meant someone was listening. Silence at home asked him to listen to himself. Sleep came suddenly and without kindness. Daniel woke sometime after midnight with his body already fighting. He tore free of the blanket, struck the bedside table, and reached toward the wall where his equipment should have been. The darkness made no sense. The ceiling was too low. The window was in the wrong place. His pulse hammered beneath his jaw while his eyes searched for an exit, a weapon, a voice giving orders. For several seconds, Daniel did not know Bozeman, the bedroom, or the snow beyond the glass. He knew only that someone was injured and that a decision had to be made before time ran out again. Maggie rose beside the bed, but did not rush him. Training and instinct kept the German Shepherd several feet away, her body alert, her ears forward, her gaze fixed on Daniel's hands. She knew that fear could make even a familiar person unpredictable. Scout knew nothing about caution. The puppy woke when Daniel's knee struck the mattress, climbed onto his stomach, and pressed both small paws against his shoulders. Daniel flinched. Scout flattened himself against Daniel's chest and became still. The puppy's heart beat quickly through the thin cotton of Daniel's shirt. Scout's breath warmed the hollow beneath his throat. Daniel could have moved him, but the puppy looked up with dark brown eyes that contained no accusation and no understanding of war. Scout did not know Ethan Cole, the last operation, or the order Daniel still replayed whenever sleep lowered his defenses. The puppy only knew that the body beneath him was breathing too fast. Daniel forced one breath to slow, then another. "Easy," he whispered, though he was no longer certain which of them needed the command. Scout's ears shifted at the familiar word. His small paws relaxed against Daniel's shoulders. Maggie stepped closer, only when Daniel's hand stopped shaking. She rested her muzzle on the edge of the mattress but did not climb up. The room returned gradually, the walnut dresser, the compass, the curtain moving above the heating vent. No explosion had occurred. No radio waited for an answer. No one needed Daniel to choose who would move and who would remain behind. By dawn, Scout was asleep again with his chin on Daniel's collarbone. Daniel had not returned to sleep. He watched gray light spread across the ceiling and felt embarrassed by the calm of the puppy's trust. Human beings often believed shame required solitude. Animals seemed to disagree. After breakfast, Daniel began repairing the house. Work had edges, measurements, and visible results. A broken fence rail did not ask where he had been or why he plans to leave again. It simply required replacing. Daniel changed the porch bulb, tightened the kitchen faucet, cleared ice from the gutters, and examined the roof from a ladder while Maggie watched from the snow below. Scout accompanied every task with enthusiasm, entirely unsupported by skill. The puppy stole Daniel's gloves, dragged a measuring tape beneath the porch, and sat squarely on the board Daniel needed to cut. Daniel lifted Scout and set him aside. Scout returned. Daniel moved him farther away. Scout returned faster. By the fourth attempt, Daniel pointed toward the steps. "Stay." Scout sat, looking deeply offended, then waited until Daniel turned around before stealing one glove again. Maggie observed her son with the weary expression of a mother realizing heredity had been too generous in the wrong direction. Across the yard, Laura remained at Ruth's house. She had changed out of her hospital scrubs and wore an old denim shirt, work pants, and her father's leather tool belt, which hung loosely around her waist. Rather than reopen the argument about moving, Laura installed a metal grab bar beside the bathtub. Ruth stood in the doorway in her moss-green cardigan, criticizing the height, the angle, and the fact that the screws were visible. "It is a safety rail, not a cathedral window," Laura said. "Your father would have hidden the screws. Dad once built a pantry door that trapped him inside. He admitted the hinge was defective. The hinge was innocent." Ruth nearly smiled, but the moment softened into silence. Laura knelt to gather her tools. "What hurt most was not that you fell," she said. "It was that you sat there alone and still decided calling me would be worse." Ruth looked at the new rail. "I don't want to become another problem scheduled between your shifts." Laura's face changed. Beneath the capable nurse was the daughter who had driven 2 hours after working all night because 3 unanswered calls had frightened her. "You are not a task," she said. "But you keep making me prove it from a distance." Ruth wanted to defend herself. Instead, she admitted that the senior community frightened her less than the possibility of becoming a duty everyone performed politely. Laura admitted that losing her father had made her mistake control for protection. Nothing was resolved neatly. Ruth still disliked the brochure, and Laura still disliked the icy steps. But for the first time, they were arguing about fear rather than furniture. At 5:47 that evening, Daniel was kneeling beside the repaired fence when he noticed Maggie had not gone to the door. The German shepherd lay beneath the porch awning where she could see both Daniel in the yard and Scout chewing a piece of harmless scrap wood beside the steps. Maggie lifted her head when the old wall clock chimed inside, but she did not move. Daniel understood that the appointment had not disappeared. It had simply found him. Later, after dinner, Daniel carried his suitcase onto the bed and opened the email containing his next flight. Departure was in 3 days. The private security company expected him overseas by the end of the week. 4 days in Bozeman had seemed generous when home was only an address. Now the room held 2 animals breathing nearby, and a silence that was beginning to feel less hostile. Maggie watched the open suitcase for a long time. Then she rose, walked downstairs, and returned carrying the worn Navy training glove. She placed it carefully between Daniel's folded shirts. Scout decided this was a game. The puppy added 1 sock, Daniel's wool hat, and a toothbrush stolen from the bathroom. Daniel laughed as he retrieved the toothbrush from Scout's mouth. Then the laughter faded. Maggie lay beside the suitcase. Scout climbed halfway into it and began searching for another possession to save. Daniel looked at the 2 dogs and realized they were not helping him pack. They were preparing for the next time he disappeared. By evening, the weather over Bozeman had changed its mind about mercy. Wind descended from the Bridger Mountains and drove fresh snow across Hawthorne Lane in long, white sheets, erasing tire tracks almost as soon as they appeared. The porch lamps glowed behind veils of ice, and the cottonwoods bent with dry, wooden groans. Inside Daniel's house, the open suitcase remained on the bedroom floor. Daniel had removed the toothbrush Scout had stolen, but he had not removed Maggie's worn blue training glove. He told himself he had simply forgotten it. Downstairs, Scout slept against Daniel's boot while Maggie rested beside the stove, one amber eye open whenever the wind struck the windows. Across the yard, Laura had driven to a nearby pharmacy to collect Ruth's pain medication and speak by phone with a hospital supervisor about temporary work in Bozeman. Ruth had promised to remain inside until Laura returned. Ruth Caldwell had kept many promises during 76 years of life. Unfortunately, she had always considered promises involving mailboxes negotiable. The Daily Mail had not been collected, and Ruth could see the dark shape of the box beyond the porch through the blowing snow. She imagined bills becoming damp, a letter from an old friend disappearing beneath a drift, or another brochure from Laura waiting to insult her independence. The sensible choice was to wait. Ruth put on Henry's old wool coat instead. The brown coat was too large through the shoulders and still carried a faint scent of cedar from the closet. Ruth wrapped a scarf around her silver hair, stepped onto the porch, and held the rail with both hands. The new layer of snow covered the ice Laura had cleared that morning. Ruth moved carefully across the short path, angry that careful movement now required planning. She reached the mailbox, found only advertisements and a utility notice, and felt foolish enough to turn back too quickly. Her right foot slid. Ruth caught the fence with one hand, but a rotten branch hidden beneath the snow snapped under her weight. She fell behind the row of cottonwoods, striking her hip and shoulder against the frozen ground. The impact forced the air from her lungs. For several seconds, Ruth heard only the storm and the dull beating of her heart. She tried to stand, but her right leg refused to support her. The house was less than 50 yards away, its porch light visible between the trunks, yet the distance seemed wider than any road Ruth had traveled alone. She called Laura's name once. The wind carried the word in the wrong direction. Inside Daniel's living room, Scout's eyes opened. The puppy lifted his head from Daniel's boot and listened. Daniel heard nothing beyond the furnace and the weather, but Scout rose, turned toward the front door, and gave one sharp bark. The sound surprised him almost as much as it surprised Daniel. Scout barked again, hurried across the floor, and scratched at the narrow gap beneath the door. "You were outside 10 minutes ago," Daniel said. Scout looked back, whined, and struck the door with both front paws. Maggie stood immediately. She approached the threshold, lifted her nose, and drew in the cold air leaking around the frame. Her body changed from watchful rest to urgent purpose. Daniel recognized the transition. Maggie was no longer reacting to Scout's restlessness. She had found something in the wind. Daniel opened the door only far enough to look outside. Maggie pushed past his leg and entered the storm. Scout followed before Daniel could catch him. The puppy vanished almost to his belly in the fresh snow, fought forward several steps, then turned and barked at Daniel as though the adult human were the one failing to understand instructions. Daniel pulled on his jacket and boots without fastening them properly. He ran after the dogs, leaving the open door swinging behind him. Scout struggled along the path, repeatedly sinking into soft drifts, but each time he rose and continued toward the cottonwoods. Maggie moved ahead in a widening pattern, nose low, reading scents scattered by the wind. Daniel saw the open mailbox, then a broken branch near the fence. "Ruth!" he called. A faint answer came from behind the trees. Maggie found Ruth first. The German shepherd circled once, checked the fallen woman from head to foot, then positioned her body on the windward side. Scout pushed through the snow and crawled against Ruth's chest, beneath the opening of Henry's coat. Ruth's gloved hand moved weakly over the puppy's back. "I suppose this means you heard me fall," she whispered. Scout pressed closer, offering the entire warmth of his small body, without understanding how little warmth he possessed. Maggie lay against Ruth's outer side, creating a barrier between her and the wind. Daniel knelt beside them and assessed Ruth as carefully as he could without moving her unnecessarily. She was awake, shivering, and able to speak. There was no blood, but pain tightened her face whenever she moved her right leg. "You were told to stay inside," Daniel said, breathless with relief and anger. "I was also told bran muffins improve with raisins," Ruth replied. "People say many unreasonable things." Daniel would have laughed if his hands had not been shaking. The storm was worsening, and waiting outside for emergency services risked further cold exposure. Ruth had fallen on relatively level ground and showed no obvious sign of spinal injury, but Daniel still moved cautiously. He supported her head and shoulders, asked about neck and back pain, then lifted her only after she denied both and confirmed sensation in her feet. Ruth weighed almost nothing inside Henry's oversized coat. Daniel carried her toward the house, while Maggie stayed close to his left leg. Scout followed in the tracks Daniel's boots created, his small face dusted white with snow. Inside, Daniel placed Ruth on the couch, covered her with blankets, and called emergency services. Scout climbed beside her and rested one paw across her wrist. Ruth watched the puppy's paw rise and fall with her pulse. "He thinks he's a doctor," she said. "He ate part of a measuring tape this morning. Many doctors have weaknesses." The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. The lead paramedic was Marcus Hill, a 36-year-old man with a broad, compact build, deep brown skin, closely shaved hair, and a calm voice that never seemed to compete with a crisis. Marcus had grown up on a cattle ranch outside Livingston, and had learned early that frightened people listened better when dignity was offered before instructions. He examined Ruth, secured her hip, and assured her that no one would make decisions about her home from the back of an ambulance. Ruth agreed to go only after Daniel promised to bring Scout's report on the condition of her wrist. Laura reached the hospital before the ambulance doors opened. Her auburn hair was wet with snow, and fear had stripped the professional calm from her face. When she learned why Ruth had gone outside, anger arrived as protection wearing armor. "You could have frozen 20 yards from your own porch." 50, Ruth corrected from the examination bed. "That does not improve it. You keep speaking as though I am a chart. And you keep behaving as though needing help makes you less human." Ruth turned toward the window. "Once I accept help, everyone will begin deciding things for me." Laura sat instead of leaving. Her voice lowered. "I do not want your house. I do not want your keys. I do not want to win. I only do not want a phone call telling me I arrived too late." The examination showed no fracture, only a severe bruise, mild hypothermia, and a strained hip. Ruth finally admitted that living safely might require changes, but she wanted those changes made with her, not for her. Laura agreed to help modify the house and said she would arrange several months of work in Bozeman. The agreement was imperfect and therefore believable. Ruth still objected to motion lights. Laura still insisted on them. Before Daniel left, Ruth caught his hand. "You left an open suitcase to run into a storm," she said. "Do not tell me you do not know where you want to be." Daniel's phone vibrated. The security company needed his final flight confirmation before midnight. He returned home through thinning snow. Upstairs, Scout was asleep inside the suitcase, his head resting on the blue training glove. Maggie lay beside it, awake and silent, her steady eyes waiting for the decision Daniel had not yet made. Morning arrived over Bozeman, with a weak winter sun and long blue shadows stretched across Hawthorne Lane. The storm had passed, leaving snow packed against the fences and frozen in silver ridges along the rooftops. Daniel Brooks sat on the edge of his bed, with his phone in one hand and the unsigned travel confirmation open on the screen. The deadline had passed at midnight, but the security company had extended it until noon because flights across Montana were still delayed. The open suitcase remained on the floor. Scout had climbed out sometime before dawn, leaving the worn blue training glove behind. Maggie lay beside the bedroom door, awake but motionless, watching Daniel with the quiet patience of an animal that had already waited longer than any decision deserved. Daniel told himself that accepting the overseas job was practical. It paid well. It used skills he understood. It kept him moving, and motion had always been easier than reflection. A person could cross oceans without ever approaching the things he feared most. Remaining in Bozeman meant sleeping in the room where his panic had found him. It meant watching Maggie study every suitcase. It meant learning what Scout expected from a man whose voice had taught him safety before his face existed. Most of all, staying meant admitting that Ethan Cole's injury still controlled him. Daniel had avoided Ethan's calls for weeks, answering messages with short phrases about schedules, transportation, and medical updates. Facts were manageable. Forgiveness was not. His phone rang at 9:14. Ethan's name appeared across the screen. Daniel almost let the call end, but Maggie lifted her head when the vibration began, and something about being judged by a German shepherd before breakfast weakened his defenses. He answered. Ethan appeared on the video from a rehabilitation gym, seated on a padded bench with 2 aluminum crutches leaning beside him. At 32, Ethan was younger than Daniel by nearly a decade. Tall and narrow through the shoulders, with sandy blonde hair growing unevenly after months of hospital cuts. His freckled face looked thinner than it had before the operation, and a healing scar disappeared beneath the collar of his gray therapy shirt. Yet his pale green eyes still carried the mischievous brightness that had once made tense rooms feel less dangerous. Ethan had grown up as the oldest of 5 children on a Nebraska farm, which had taught him to make jokes during trouble because panic rarely helped when a tractor overturned or a younger brother broke something expensive. "You look terrible," Ethan said. "Montana must be rougher than advertised." Daniel looked at the crutches. "How is the leg?" "Still attached. Very inconsiderate of it." Ethan's humor faded when Daniel did not smile. "You ignored 6 calls." "I was traveling." "You crossed a time zone, Daniel."
"You did not cross the moon."
Daniel looked toward the window. Scout was in the yard below, attempting to follow Maggie through snow twice the height of his legs. "I gave the order," Daniel said. Ethan's face became still. "You ordered the team to withdraw. I sent you back toward the East Passage. I chose to return when I heard Mason calling. You followed a route I approved, and your decision got 4 people out." Daniel felt the familiar resistance rise inside him. Guilt had become a structure with locked doors, and Ethan was speaking as though facts could dismantle it. "You were injured because I missed something." Ethan leaned forward, pain briefly tightening his face. "I was injured because a wall collapsed during an operation where nothing went according to plan. I made my own choice. Stop stealing responsibility from me because you need someone to punish." Daniel stared at the floorboards. No one had ever accused him of using guilt as arrogance. Yet that was what Ethan meant. By accepting blame for every outcome, Daniel had quietly denied that anyone else possessed courage, judgment, or agency. Ethan reached for one crutch and stood, balancing awkwardly but stubbornly. "Look at me," he said. Daniel raised his eyes. Ethan took 3 uneven steps across the gym floor. Sweat gathered along his hairline, but he remained upright. "I am still here. I am angry, tired, and getting extremely good at insulting physical therapists, but I am alive. You cannot turn the fact that I survived into a reason for you to stop living." The words remained after the call ended. Daniel sat before the suitcase while the house moved around him. Pipes clicked inside the walls. Wind brushed loose snow from the roof. Scout entered the bedroom, sniffed the open luggage, and looked at Daniel. The puppy did not climb inside this time. Instead, Scout picked up one of Daniel's socks and carried it to the small bed beside Maggie's blanket. He returned for the wool hat, dragging it by the edge. Then he disappeared downstairs and came back struggling with Daniel's old brown jacket, the sleeves trailing behind him like defeated enemies. Daniel watched Scout arrange the objects in the bed, turning 3 circles before lying among them. The puppy was not helping him pack. Scout was collecting pieces of Daniel's scent, building a substitute for the man who might soon be gone. Maggie had done the same for almost a year with the blue glove. Animals did not understand contracts, duty schedules, or the sophisticated arguments people used to justify leaving. They understood presence and absence. Daniel realized he had spent years treating departure as proof of strength, because staying exposed too much. A person who remained could be needed. A person who was needed could fail. A person always leaving could pretend no one had been close enough to lose. Across the yard, Laura had begun modifying Ruth's house according to their uneasy agreement. The project immediately became another battlefield. Ruth wanted a polished oak handrail along the hallway because Henry had used oak throughout the house. Laura wanted powder-coated steel because it could support more weight and required less maintenance. Ruth said the metal looked like hospital equipment. Laura said a broken hip would look worse. Their argument lasted through breakfast, lunch, and most of the following day. Daniel heard it while replacing a damaged step outside. Finally, he entered Ruth's workshop where Henry's old tools still hung in careful outlines on the wall. Daniel selected a solid oak board, drilled a narrow channel through its center, and inserted a steel support rod before sealing the wood around it. The finished rail looked like Henry's work but carried the strength Laura wanted. Ruth ran her fingers across the grain. "A solution designed by a man terrified of disappointing everyone," she said. Laura tested the rail with both hands. "Sometimes those men build the strongest things." Daniel pretended to check the screws so neither woman would notice how precisely the comment had landed. At noon, Daniel called the security company. He declined the contract, canceled the flight, and listened while the recruiter warned that another position might not remain available. Daniel thanked him and ended the call before fear could reopen negotiations. The house did not change. No music rose from the walls. No sudden peace entered his chest. Healing, Daniel understood, was rarely dramatic. Sometimes it was simply choosing not to purchase another ticket away from oneself. At 5:47 that afternoon, the old clock sounded from the living room. Maggie woke beside the fireplace and turned toward the front door. Daniel stopped stacking wood. For several seconds, the German Shepherd remained perfectly still, as though the old year and the new life stood on opposite sides of the room. Then Maggie rose. She walked to the door, picked up the worn blue training glove, and carried it back to Daniel. She placed it in his lap. Scout climbed onto the couch beside the glove, turned once, and curled into sleep against Daniel's leg. For the first time in nearly a year, the place before the door was completely empty. 1 year later, winter returned to Bozeman with a gentler hand. Snow rested along Hawthorne Lane in smooth white folds. The Bridger Mountains stood clear beneath a pale morning sky, and the cottonwoods outside Daniel Brooks's house carried small crowns of frost. Daniel was still there. He had learned that canceling one flight did not cancel fear, and choosing to remain did not magically teach a restless mind how to rest. During the first months, Daniel attended weekly therapy with a counselor who never praised him for enduring pain in silence. He began working part-time with the Gallatin County Search and Rescue Team and volunteered twice a week at a program that paired trained dogs with older veterans. The work gave his days structure without turning every hour into another escape route. Maggie, now 6 years old, had become a reliable volunteer search dog. Silver had spread around her muzzle, but her black and tan body remained strong, her movements controlled and economical. She crossed snowy fields with her nose low, ignored distractions, and returned to Daniel's side whenever called. Scout had grown into a tall young German shepherd with broad paws, a dark saddle, warm brown eyes, and one ear that still leaned slightly whenever curiosity outweighed dignity. Scout had inherited Maggie's sensitivity, but not her solemnity. He could detect anxiety across a crowded room, then steal a sandwich before anyone finished praising him for it. At the Veterans Center, Daniel watched Scout choose people before people chose him. One winter afternoon, the young dog crossed a room filled with folding chairs and stopped beside Thomas Reed, a 78-year-old widower who had served as an Army medic decades earlier. Thomas was a lean man with narrow shoulders, dark brown skin, close-cropped white hair, and long hands marked by arthritis. His face carried deep lines around the mouth, as though years of kindness had competed with years of grief and neither had fully won. Since his wife, Evelyn, died 18 months earlier, Thomas had become quieter and increasingly skilled at pretending he was only tired. During the group meeting, a metal serving tray fell in the kitchen. The crash was ordinary, but Thomas's body reacted before his mind could remind it where he was. His breathing shortened. His hands tightened around the arms of the chair. He looked toward the nearest exit and tried to disguise the movement by adjusting his coat. Scout left Daniel without a command. The young German shepherd walked directly to Thomas and sat across both of the older man's shoes, making departure impossible without negotiation. Scout placed one paw on Thomas's knee and waited. He did not bark, climb into the man's lap, or demand affection. He simply remained.
Thomas stared down at the crooked ear and whispered,
"You saw that, did you?" Scout leaned his shoulder against Thomas's shin. The older man's fingers loosened one at a time. Daniel stood across the room and felt the past circle back without repeating itself. Scout had once placed two small paws against Daniel's shoulders because the frightened body beneath him was breathing too fast. Now the dog offered the same quiet interruption to another person. Daniel understood that Scout had not been born only to repair one wounded man. The puppy who had learned safety from a voice without a face had grown into a living reminder that fear could be met without judgment. Healing remained less graceful at home. Some nights Daniel still woke with his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the sheets. Maggie would rise from the rug at the foot of the bed and stand where he could see her. Scout, too large now to climb onto Daniel's chest without consequences, would rest his heavy head across Daniel's ribs until the man's breathing slowed. Neither dog erased the memory of Ethan's injury, or the decisions Daniel still questioned. Maggie and Scout did something less miraculous and more useful. They prevented memory from becoming the only presence in the room. Daniel learned to name difficult nights rather than treat them as failure. He called Ethan regularly. Ethan now walked with a cane on bad days and no assistance on good ones, and he continued insulting rehabilitation exercises with impressive creativity. Their friendship no longer revolved around apology. It had returned to arguments about football, coffee, and which of them had aged more badly. Across the yard, Ruth Caldwell continued living in the house Henry had built. The new oak handrails contained hidden steel, the porch lights activated with movement, and a small call button rested on a table beside her favorite chair. Ruth claimed she would use it only in the event of a bear, a fire, or Laura making stew too salty. Laura had rented a modest cottage 3 streets away and accepted a nursing position at Bozeman Health. She still worried too much, but she had learned to ask before reorganizing Ruth's medicine cabinet. Ruth still resisted help, but she had begun admitting when the stairs hurt. Their progress was imperfect, which made it durable. On Saturdays, Ruth and Laura hosted coffee in the old Caldwell dining room. Widows, retired teachers, veterans, caregivers, and older neighbors who disliked eating alone gathered beneath Henry's handmade ceiling beams. Thomas Reed attended after Scout's intervention at the center, initially claiming he came only because Ruth served better coffee than the government. Ruth replied that this was not a meaningful achievement. Walter Briggs, now retired from the Postal Service, brought cinnamon rolls and continued confusing house numbers despite no longer being paid to do so. The gathering had no official name. Ruth refused suggestions involving words such as support, grief, or senior. A handwritten card near the coffee pot simply read, "Sit wherever there is room." The house Ruth once feared losing became fuller than it had been while she was trying to protect it from change. On the anniversary of Daniel's return, evening snow began falling over Bozeman. Daniel drove home after an ordinary day spent reviewing search patterns and helping Thomas practice grounding exercises with Scout. The faded blue truck still had its dented rear bumper and uneven engine, though Daniel had replaced enough other parts that Ruth called it a new vehicle wearing an old vehicle's coat. When the truck turned onto Hawthorne Lane, Scout's head rose from the living room rug. The young German shepherd ran to the dog door, crossed the porch, and bounded into the snow. Daniel stepped from the truck. Scout stopped before him, rose onto his hind legs, and lifted both front paws in the same unbalanced gesture he had made as a tiny puppy. Daniel caught him beneath the chest. Scout was far too large for the pose now, and Daniel staggered backward, laughing as the dog's paws landed on his shoulders. Maggie came down the steps more slowly and pressed her side against Daniel's leg. For a moment, The three stood together beneath the falling snow. The man who had once feared being forgotten, the mother who had guarded a promise, and the puppy who had recognized home before understanding what home meant. Inside, beneath Maggie's blanket, the worn blue training glove remained hidden in her bed. It no longer waited beside the door or rested inside a suitcase. It was simply an old object that had completed its work. Daniel had once believed Maggie sat at the door to prove she remembered him. He understood now that memory had never been the question. Maggie waited because she trusted the promise of return. Scout had never known Daniel's face during those first weeks of life. He knew only the voice that calmed his mother and made a frightened room feel safe. When Scout first reached toward Daniel, the puppy understood nothing about deployment, guilt, or distance. He recognized a sound that had belonged to his family before his eyes were fully open. No one in the two houses was completely healed. Daniel still endured long nights. Ruth still needed the rail when stepping onto the porch. Laura still worried beyond reasonable limits. Maggie's muzzle grew whiter, and Scout still stole socks whenever the laundry basket was left unguarded. But supper remained warm. The porch lights remained on. At 5:47, no one sat waiting before the door. The door was only a door again. And for hearts that had spent too long living like waiting rooms, that was a happy ending, honest enough to keep. Maybe the miracle was never that Maggie remembered, or that Scout recognized a voice he had never seen. Maybe the miracle was that God used two faithful animals to remind a wounded man that home was still waiting for him. People often believe healing means forgetting the pain, becoming strong again, or returning to the person they were before life changed them. Daniel's journey shows something more honest. Healing can mean staying when every instinct tells us to run. It can mean accepting help without feeling weak, forgiving ourselves for what we could not control, and allowing love to sit beside us through the long nights. Maggie could not explain faith, yet she practiced it every evening. Scout could not understand guilt, yet he knew when a frightened heart needed company. Sometimes God's mercy reaches us through the simplest things: a warm meal, a light left on, a neighbor who notices, or an animal that refuses to leave. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Tell us in the comments what home means to you, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty and healing. May God protect you, comfort your heart, and guide you safely through every season.